Happy Father's Day, dads! Today we're going to be talking about fatherhood in Christ. But even if you aren't a father, maybe you can still get something out of today's reflection. So today, as I tend to do, I have a few different points. And the first one is that a godly father influences. I wanted to take a personal story from my own background. When I was a kid, I was raised in a Christian home. So on Sundays, we would go to church, even if I didn't always want to. We would sit, and I'd have to sit quietly and be respectful. I loved singing the hymns and things. My dad always really loved the teaching. And I remember even looking at his old worn Bible and thinking he should buy a new one. But then I realized that maybe it was that it was so used because he had used it so much and had read it so much, and I didn't really grasp that at the time. Something else that happened in the weekends at our house for a while was that my dad would go out and would deliver sandwiches to homeless people. And I remember on various occasions we would make sandwiches and help make sandwiches as a family, or my mom would be making them in the kitchen, and we'd put them in the bags, and then he would take them, and maybe probably some fruit and something else, to different homeless people. And his goal was to go and talk to them about Christ, but he wanted to come with something and help to meet an immediate need, which of course the homeless people would have. And I've always thought that was a really interesting thing, because even on other occasions we might be driving to Florida on vacation, and my dad would see somebody by the side of the road, and he would walk over to them and talk to them and give them some money. He might not have done that necessarily to instruct me, but I noticed it, and it had an impact on me, even at an early age. And so what I want us to think about is Genesis, chapters 4 through 5. We can see that, if you remember Cain and Abel, that Cain killed his brother Abel, and then generations pass, and Lamech kills somebody as well. And we see this trend kind of where Cain ends up killing somebody, and later on, Lamech also kills somebody. What you see, though, is you see that there's this multi-generational wickedness, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And in Genesis, there's kind of this contrast between Cain's genealogy and his brother Seth. Now, Seth was not Abel, who had passed away, but Seth was the other brother. And so you see in Genesis 5 that you have Seth's genealogy, which leads us to Enoch, who walked with God and was potentially one of the people in the Bible that never died. And then you get eventually to Noah. And so what we can take from this idea, that's this contrast between these two brothers, is that sinfulness and holiness can continue throughout generations. And this is most likely because of the influence from one generation to the next. Although there might be outliers in those that could come from a great family and still end up being bad seeds, because you still have Cain and Seth coming from the same parents and being very different. But in general, you can still see this trending through the families. So if you do a Google search on something like father's impact on religion, then what you can find is that in the case of fathers going to church with their children and the whole family, the children's likelihood of staying in church for the rest of their life is much higher than if just the mother goes with the kids or if nobody goes to church. And so what we can see is that there actually is an impact the father has on the kids. He has an influence on his family. Whether he wants to have that or not, he has an influence. And so again, this first point is that a godly father influences. Whether you want it to be or not, your children are watching you. Children are looking at you. Like in the instance of my own dad, he went out and gave food to those who needed it, gave food to the homeless, because he had a heart for those people and wanted them to know Christ. And as a kid, that was very interesting for me to see. And as an adult, that challenges me on a different level to think about, am I doing that with my own life? Am I living out my faith the way that my father did when he was my age? And so that's something that you have to be aware of as a father, that you're influencing your kids. So the next point then, because you have that influence, a godly father instructs. So we're going to read some Bible verses. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Proverbs 1:8 says, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." Proverbs 3:12, "Because the Lord disciplines those he loves, as a father the son he delights in." Proverbs 4:1, "Listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding." And so in many of these we can see this idea of instruction being mentioned, and even discipline on Proverbs 3:12. And so I kind of take this to mean instruction isn't just teaching, right? But instruction is this idea of forming and teaching the difference between right and wrong, teaching consequences, teaching things good and bad can happen depending on your decisions. And so the second story that I wanted to tell you was that instruction is not always good, doesn't always feel good, maybe even as a parent and obviously as the receiving end as a kid, but it's necessary to show the difference between right and wrong. So when I was a teenager, and I was, I think, probably 14 or 15, so one night I found myself on the internet, probably chatting with friends perhaps, or doing research for school or something, and my parents might have been in bed at that point, and I just decided to look up inappropriate images. And I'd heard about, pornography before. I didn't ever really experiment with it or look into it, but that night I just thought, well, I want to see what all the fuss is about. And I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I probably did it a couple nights when I saw that there were no consequences. And then one day I came downstairs, and my parents, my mom and dad, asked me if I knew about those images. My dad had found the different websites that I'd visited, and I had to come clean. He confronted me, and mom was there too, and they explained to me that was inappropriate, that was wrong. And it gave me that opportunity to come forward with my sin and to apologize and to find healing, but also to know the boundary, because knowing the boundary is so important for us. And they say even the terrible twos, that they're so terrible because they're exploring the boundaries in life. Imagine a person who never has boundaries. How are they going to turn out? So Proverbs 13:21 says, "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." Now, the idea here isn't necessarily that it has to be a physical spanking or something. Some people get upset about that. But whatever you do as a parent, as a dad, you have to realize that whether you want to or not, you must be careful to discipline your children. It's instruction is teaching the difference between right and wrong. You are letting them know when they have misstepped. You're letting them know where the boundary is so that they can understand where they have to stop or where they shouldn't even approach in life. And this is healthy for them, right? And the Bible talks about this, and we're going to see the verse in a minute, but it talks about that if children obey their mother and their father, there's a promise with that in Ephesians. It talks about this, that they will have long days, right? They'll have a long life, hopefully. And we discipline and we teach and we instruct the difference between right and wrong, even though it's not always fun, but we do that because we want our children to grow and to mature and to eventually be able to live without us always breathing down their neck or, being helicopter parents or lawnmower parents, whatever the new term is. And then the question is, if we don't instruct them, if we as fathers, obviously mothers too, but if we do not instruct them as fathers, who will? Could be the mother, of course, right? But we can see the influence that we have as fathers based on the search that I had done, that we have a very big influence on our kids and what they do, right? And so if we should be influencing them and instructing them and being an active role in that, and if we don't, then who are we expecting to do it? Because Hollywood would love to have a shot at instructing my kids about the difference between right and wrong, and it will look vastly different than if I do it. The music industry, on the radio, all the love songs, etc., they as well would love to instruct my children on what is right and what is wrong. Commercials and companies, etc., they would love to tell my kids what the next false gospel is and how to truly find happiness through this new product, etc., etc. Everybody will instruct my children and give them a false gospel of how they are going to find worth or peace or love and acceptance, etc. All of those will chew them up and spit them out. So maybe the church could be the one to instruct them, but they might only go to church for an hour or two a week and have a class with people that, a teacher that they don't really even know and see and observe and are influenced by. Maybe they are, but for 2 hours a week, and then the other 100 plus hours that they're awake during the week, somebody else is instructing them. Somebody else is filling them up with lies or with false gospels, etc. And so if I as a father have that level of influence, then I need to instruct my kids. And why? Proverbs 13:1 says, "A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not respond to rebukes." Proverbs 23:24 says, "The father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him." Proverbs 30:17 says, "The eye that mocks a father, that scorns an aged mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley, will be eaten by the vultures." So we can see some pretty strong imagery there, right? But Proverbs 30:17 basically giving us this idea that we instruct our children so that they will either prosper and do well, prospering in the sense of God, not necessarily in the sense of the world, that they would do well, that they would have a long, prosperous life, and they could bring us joy as well as fathers. But if they don't, then most likely there will be consequences. And that's where the instruction comes from. We teach them at young ages. There are consequences when you do the wrong thing, so that when they get older, they might still live with that understanding in the world. And so Ephesians 6:2-3 that I mentioned before says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy a long life on earth. And so there's the third story of my father that I remember that I think kind of helps us today. So when I was in college, I got involved in a Hispanic church, and I started going to the church, and then I eventually graduated from college, moved into the church, which was an apartment kind of right next to the church. And I helped with the youth group. I helped with the worship music. I just really had a heart. God really gave me a heart for those people. And just, I'm so grateful for that experience. I remember that at one point I was visiting my parents. We went to a birthday party for a family friend. And while we were there, my dad and I were talking to somebody, and my dad told them, well, tell them what you do. And so I started talking about how I was teaching. That was what I had to do. That was what God provided so that I could work in this church and serve, kind of my tent making mission. And then my dad said, no. Tell them what you really do. Tell them why you're really there. And so I started sharing about the church and etc. But what got me there was I could see in him that he wanted me to share that, because even though in Proverbs 23:24, it says, the father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him. That my father was proud of me. He wouldn't necessarily say that. He's not very good with words in that way. But he was proud of me because of the choices that I had made, because of the values that he had instilled in me when I was growing up. And so that serving in this church was the most obvious thing for me to do. And yet for him, it made him proud. And so going into that, we can see a godly father influences, a godly father instructs, and this leads to a godly father pointing their children towards God. So if I looked up in the New Testament how many times God is referred to as a father, I might have miscounted, but it's over 130 is what I got, right? So if God is referred to as a father over 130 times in the New Testament, then we have this concept of God as a heavenly father. God is our father. Right? God is the father of the Christians. And so if we believe in God as the heavenly father, then it's so important that a godly father lives well, that they do things well. They are an influence and they are there to instruct. Because if a father is a bad example of what a father will be, which will happen in this world that is fallen, then how much harder will it be for their children to see God referred to in the Bible as our Father and feel his love and acceptance and understand what that really means. There might be some who would reject God as a father because their own father was not good to them. Their perception might hinder them from seeking him. And so it's important for godly fathers to point their children towards God. And they're going to screw up too, right? In fact, even in their screw-ups, they can point their children to God. And this is this hierarchy that we've talked about a couple weeks ago. So if fathers and mothers are teaching their children and instructing them what is good and what is bad, then the children understand there are consequences for bad actions, and there could be positive things that are going on for good behaviors. And so as a result of that, when they get out of the house, they might still understand that there are laws, that there's a society, that there are other things. They would do the right things because they were raised to do the right thing. And they would ignore the wrong things or reject the wrong things because they would know that there are consequences. And so this continues with the hierarchy, right? But so they could be good citizens because their parents have raised them. But ultimately, they can also submit. The idea is of submission to a higher authority. And the highest authority, of course, being God. That if we raise them young to submit, to teach and help them understand that there is somebody higher than them, and there are times in life that you have to submit to somebody above you, they're more inclined to be able to do that with God. But imagine the person whose parents never showed them that somebody was above them. The kid never learned that they had to submit to somebody higher than them, whether that be the law, whether it be their parents, but ultimately God, right? Then their lack of a fear of God would translate into they're not ever submitting to anybody except to themselves. And Psalm 103:13 says, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. And so even this psalm won't make sense if the kids don't understand a father and a godly father. Because maybe their father didn't have compassion on his children because we live in a fallen world, right? But as godly fathers, our goal is to strive for that, to have compassion on our children. Because in doing so, we are modeling the way the Lord is for his children, for those who have received Christ. In Hebrews 12:7 says, "Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father?" And so with these two different verses, we can see that God is compassionate as a father, but he also disciplines. And it's that idea of instruction. He's kind and he's loving, and he helps us grow, but he helps us grow when we need to through discipline, just like a parent would, to instruct us and to help us grow and to be sanctified. So coming back to a godly father, by instructing their children, was also instructing them in things of God, which will then translate into those kids understanding God as a father, and then realizing that when God instructs them, it's not too different than their own parent instructing them. But why be godly fathers? Why bother? Well, the church starts in our homes. As we saw when I talked about what I'd searched for in Google, the father going to church is a huge factor in children continually going to church when they're older and grown up. And so if the father is not doing that, then why would the kids go? It showed the decline, right, in the percentages. But also, the church starts in our homes through our influence, but also through our instruction. We can't expect the church to do everything. We can't expect the church to teach our children, and we don't have to. We should be teaching our children in our home as well. We should be influencing them as well as instructing them. And then what happens at church can be just icing on the cake. If we aren't fathers to our children, how can our children see God as a father? If we aren't godly fathers to our children, how can we expect our children to love and serve God? Let us be fathers. Let us be godly. And let us point our children to love God and serve him. I pray that this message finds you well. If you're a father, happy Father's Day. If you know a father, please encourage them today and congratulate them. God bless.